Michael Carter's unexpected battle at 30.000 feet. Michael Carter stepped into the bustling terminal of JFK International Airport, rolling a sleek black carry-on beside him. His wife, Vanessa, elegantly dressed in a casual yet refined outfit, held their 5-year-old son, Ethan, by the hand. The boy skipped excitedly, his small fingers clutching a plastic airplane toy. "First-class treatment for my little co-pilot," Michael teased, ruffling his son's curly hair. Ethan giggled, oblivious to the storm about to unfold. Michael wasn't just any passenger. He was a self-made multimillionaire and one of the airline's primary shareholders. Though he never flaunted his wealth, he believed in staying humble, dressing simply, and treating everyone with respect. But today, his patience would be tested in ways he hadn't expected. Revolving light if you want to see more powerful stories like this. Hit that subscribe button for RVM Black Struggles. Revolving light. As they reached the boarding gate, the attendant scanned their tickets with a polite nod. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter." They made their way through the jet bridge and into the first-class cabin, where plush leather seats gleamed under the cabin lights. Michael helped Vanessa settle into her seat and lifted their carry-on into the overhead bin. Ethan climbed into his seat by the window, bouncing with excitement. Across the cabin, Rebecca Summers, a senior flight attendant, took one glance at them and immediately stiffened. Her professional smile didn't reach her eyes as she instinctively reached for her clipboard. She had worked first class for years, serving high-profile clients, CEOs, celebrities, and politicians. And yet, something about this family seemed out of place. Her eyes flickered with skepticism as she strode over, her heels clicking sharply against the cabin floor. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. But there was an unmistakable edge to it. "I'll need to see your boarding passes." Michael, unbothered, reached into his jacket and handed them over. "Of course," he said smoothly. Vanessa, however, sensed something, an air of condescension behind the request. She exchanged a glance with her husband. Rebecca took the tickets and examined them for a few long, deliberate seconds. Too long. First class, fully paid, everything was in order. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll need to confirm this with the front desk," she muttered before briskly turning on her heels and disappearing behind the curtain. Michael sighed, sitting back. "Here we go," he murmured under his breath. Speech balloon. What do you think is about to happen next? If you're enjoying this story, comment 1 below. If you think it's unfair, comment 0. And if you're not sure, just hit subscribe. "Michael, what's going on?" Vanessa asked softly. "Routine check," he replied, though the tightening of his jaw suggested otherwise. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, Rebecca clutched the phone with a sense of urgency. "I have a situation," she whispered. "There's a family in first class, and I'm not sure their tickets are valid. Can you double-check?" The response came swiftly. "The Carters?" "Yes. Their reservation was confirmed weeks ago." "What's the issue?" Rebecca hesitated. She had been so certain, and yet, she wasn't ready to let it go. Instead of returning with an apology, she inhaled deeply, straightened her blazer, and walked back into the cabin. This time, her voice was colder, sharper. "I'm sorry, but I need you to step aside for a moment," she told Michael. "There seems to be an error with your booking." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. Ethan, sensing the change in atmosphere, clutched his toy airplane tighter. Michael rose slowly, his towering presence commanding without effort. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes carried an unmistakable intensity. "What kind of error?" he asked evenly. "I need you to follow me to the galley while we sort this out," Rebecca responded, her tone leaving no room for argument. As Michael cast one last reassuring glance toward Vanessa, whispers began rippling through the cabin. Passengers exchanged looks, some sensed that something wasn't right. And as Michael followed Rebecca past the drawn curtain, one thought echoed in his mind. She has no idea who she's dealing with. Fire if you love stories about justice, resilience, and fighting back against injustice. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to RVM Black Struggles. More powerful stories coming soon. Rocket. As Michael Carter stepped into the galley, Rebecca Summers followed closely behind, her posture stiff, her expression unreadable. The small space smelled of freshly brewed coffee and airline meals. but there was a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the plane's ventilation. Michael folded his arms, his gaze steady. "All right, I'm here. Now tell me, what exactly is the issue with my booking?" Rebecca hesitated for a split second, as if searching for an answer. She knew she had nothing concrete, but her pride wouldn't let her back down now. "Sir," she began, her voice carrying a false air of authority. "First-class seating is extremely limited. We have a very exclusive list of passengers who qualify for these seats. I just need to ensure that your reservation is accurate." Michael arched an eyebrow. "Exclusive?" His tone was neutral, but there was a dangerous edge behind it. Rebecca cleared her throat. "Yes, I mean, we have certain protocols in place." Michael let the words hang in the air. He could feel the weight of them, carefully chosen, but carrying a very clear implication. He'd heard variations of this conversation before. Protocol, exclusive, qualified. It was always the same coded language. "I see," he said smoothly. "And tell me, exactly what about me suggests I don't belong here?" Rebecca stiffened. "That's not what I'm saying." Michael took a step closer. Not in an intimidating way, but with a calm, unshakable presence that made Rebecca falter. "Then what are you saying?" he pressed. Rebecca's jaw clenched. "Sir, I'm simply trying to do my job. Please cooperate, or I will be forced to escalate this situation." Michael inhaled deeply, shaking his head. "All right." His voice was controlled, but his patience was wearing thin. "Go ahead, escalate it." For the first time, Rebecca hesitated. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. Most people in his situation would back down, accept the unspoken message and quietly move to coach. But Michael wasn't most people. She was about to respond when another flight attendant entered the galley. Grace Thomas, younger and more level-headed, had been watching from a distance. "Everything okay here?" she asked cautiously, her gaze flicking between them. Rebecca forced a smile. "Just handling a seating issue." Grace's brow furrowed. "His ticket's valid. I saw it myself." Rebecca shot her a warning look. "Stay out of this, Grace." Grace didn't budge. She looked at Michael, then back at Rebecca, realization dawning on her. "Is this really about a seating issue?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca ignored her and turned back to Michael. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you and your family to move to the main cabin until we can fully verify your reservation." At that moment, Vanessa appeared at the curtain, concern in her eyes. "What's going on?" she asked. Michael exhaled through his nose. His patience stretched to its limits. He looked at his wife, then at Rebecca. "They want us to leave first class," he said simply. Vanessa's expression darkened. "On what grounds?" Rebecca squared her shoulders. "It's protocol, ma'am." Vanessa scoffed. "Protocol?" Her voice dripped with disbelief. By now, passengers in first class were openly watching, their murmurs growing louder. "That doesn't seem right," a middle-aged man whispered to his wife. "They were already sitting there. Why are they being removed?" Another passenger muttered. Across the aisle, an elderly woman leaned toward a businessman and said, "I think I know exactly what this is." Michael knew this was a fight he could win right now. He had the power to make a scene, to turn the entire cabin against Rebecca in an instant. But instead, he made a different move. He turned to Vanessa and gently took her hand. "It's fine," he said. "Let's go." Rebecca let out a breath of relief as Michael, Vanessa, and Ethan gathered their belongings. But what Rebecca didn't realize, what no one on that plane realized, was that as Michael stood, he was already setting a plan in motion. As he walked past Rebecca, he pulled out his phone, typing a single, calculated message. Now would be a good time. Then, without another word, he led his family toward the main cabin, the whispers of stunned passengers following them all the way down the aisle. But this wasn't over. Not even close. As Michael Carter walked down the aisle toward the main cabin, his steps were measured, deliberate. He held Vanessa's hand firmly, ensuring she didn't lash out, because he knew she wanted to. Ethan, still clutching his toy airplane, looked up at his father. "Daddy, why are we moving?" he asked, his small voice tinged with confusion. Michael bent down to meet his son's gaze. "Just a little mix-up, buddy," he said softly. "We'll be okay." Behind them, the first-class passengers watched in stunned silence. A few exchanged knowing glances. Some murmured quietly, while others sat in awkward discomfort, unwilling to say anything out loud. Rebecca Summers straightened her uniform. smoothing down the front of her blazer as if brushing away any guilt. In her mind, she had won. She returned to her duties in first class, her sense of control restored. But she had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the pilot's intercom buzzed, jolting Captain Ryan Matthews out of his routine pre-flight checklist. He adjusted his headset and answered, his voice calm and professional. "This is Captain Matthews." A voice came through, but it wasn't air traffic control. It was a direct line from corporate. "Captain, this is executive control. We have a situation on board your flight involving a priority shareholder. You need to ensure that the cabin crew is handling it correctly." Matthews frowned, glancing at his co-pilot. "Who's the shareholder?" A brief pause. Then, the name dropped like a bomb. Michael Carter. The captain's stomach sank. He knew that name. Everyone in the airline industry did. The man wasn't just rich. He wasn't just a frequent flyer. He was one of the airline's biggest investors, with enough power to shake the entire company to its core. "Sir, can you confirm the issue?" Captain Matthews asked, already dreading the answer. "Reports say he and his family were removed from first class under questionable circumstances." Matthews gritted his teeth. Questionable circumstances. That was corporate speak for someone just messed up big time. He inhaled slowly. "Understood," he said. "I'll look into it immediately." But before he could even unbuckle his seatbelt, his intercom buzzed again, this time with a priority call. It was from Michael Carter himself. Matthews exchanged a glance with his co-pilot before answering. "Mr. Carter, this is Captain Matthews. How can I help?" Michael's voice was calm, but there was an undeniable authority beneath it. "Captain, I assume by now you're aware that my family and I were removed from our paid first-class seats for no valid reason." Matthews clenched his jaw. "I just received word about that." "Sir, I don't need explanations," Michael interrupted smoothly. "I need solutions. Because if this issue isn't handled immediately, I will be having a very different conversation with the airline's board of directors." A cold sweat prickled at the captain's neck. He knew what that meant. This wasn't just a complaint. This was a crisis. "I understand, sir," Matthews said. "Give me a moment." He ended the call and pressed the intercom button for the lead flight attendant. "Rebecca Summers," he said, his voice tight. "Report to the cockpit, now." Meanwhile, back in the first-class cabin, passengers had not forgotten what had just happened. A tall, middle-aged businessman leaned toward his seatmate and whispered. That was uncomfortable. The older woman next to him huffed. It was disgusting. That man paid for his seat, and she treated him like some kind of imposter. Across the aisle, a younger man scrolled through his phone. "You guys are not gonna believe this," he muttered. "What?" someone asked. He turned his phone around, showing them a breaking news alert from a major business network. It read, "Red Circle breaking. CEO and board members of Airline name alerted to VIP passenger dispute on Flight 237. Investigation underway." Passengers stared at each other in shock. "Wait," the businessman whispered, realization dawning. "You mean, that guy was important?" The young man nodded. "Not just important, he's a top shareholder. He literally owns part of this airline." The murmurs grew louder. Passengers who had stayed silent before now felt emboldened. "That flight attendant is done for," someone muttered. "She should be," another agreed. And yet, while Rebecca was still obliviously doing her rounds, the storm outside was gaining speed. Back in the galley, Rebecca's radio crackled to life. "Summers, report to the cockpit." She blinked. "Excuse me?" The voice repeated, firmer this time. Immediately, a pit formed in her stomach. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong. With one final glance toward the first-class passengers, she turned and made her way toward the cockpit, her heartbeat quickening with every step. She stepped inside and saw Captain Matthews standing there, arms crossed. He didn't look happy. Rebecca swallowed hard. "Captain?" she asked. Matthews didn't waste time. "Tell me exactly what happened with passenger Michael Carter." Her blood ran cold at the mention of the name. She hesitated. I removed him due to a seating issue." Matthews' eyes darkened. "A seating issue?" Rebecca forced herself to maintain eye contact. "Yes, sir." The captain slowly reached for his tablet, tapped the screen, and turned it around. Rebecca's heart nearly stopped. On the screen was Michael Carter's profile in the airline system. Under his name, in bold letters, it read, Executive level shareholder. Priority status. High. Rebecca couldn't breathe. The captain leaned in. Do you have any idea what you just did? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since this all started, she realized just how badly she had messed up. In the cockpit, Rebecca's career begins to crumble. Rebecca Summers could feel the weight of the silence in the cockpit pressing down on her. Captain Matthews stood tall, his expression unreadable, but his eyes? They were razor sharp. He tapped the screen of his tablet, his voice low and controlled. You removed a priority shareholder, one of our biggest investors. From his first-class seat, Rebecca's mouth went dry. I didn't know. The captain scoffed. That's the problem, Summers. You didn't know, because you didn't check. You acted first and assumed the worst. Rebecca felt a flicker of indignation rising in her chest. Sir, I was following protocol. Captain Matthews cut her off with a cold, humorless laugh. Protocol? He stepped forward, his voice dripping with disbelief. Let me ask you something. If that had been a white family in designer suits, would you have asked them to step aside? Rebecca's stomach twisted into knots. I don't see color when I work. Sir. The captain's gaze bored into her soul. Bull *****, he said flatly. Rebecca flinched. Matthews didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. But his words cut deeper than any public humiliation ever could. You humiliated that man in front of his wife and child. And now, not only do we have a PR nightmare on our hands, but I just got word. The airline's CEO and the board have been directly notified. Rebecca's blood ran cold. The board? The CEO? No. She had dealt with difficult customers before, had some pushback, had filed complaints, but this was career-ending territory. Captain Matthews exhaled, shaking his head. We're in damage control now. Summers, if I were you, I'd start thinking about how you're going to explain yourself when we land. Rebecca felt the walls closing in. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Michael Carter sat calmly, sipping from a plastic cup of water, watching everything unfold with the patience of a man who already knew how the game would end. Vanessa, on the other hand, was fuming. You should have fought harder. She hissed under her breath. You shouldn't have let them just move us like that. Michael smirked, placing a hand over hers. Oh, sweetheart, he said smoothly. I'm fighting harder than you think. Vanessa blinked. What do you mean? Michael glanced at his phone and turned the screen toward her. A single text message sat on the screen. Damage report? Update me. Vanessa's eyes widened. He had already activated his legal team. Her lips parted in understanding, and a slow, proud smile spread across her face. You sneaky, brilliant man. Michael chuckled. Let's just say, the storm is just getting started. In first class, the passengers start speaking up. The murmurs in first class had turned into full-blown conversations. Passengers, many of whom had been silent before, were now furious. That flight attendant was out of line. I can't believe they just let this happen. I knew something was off the moment she questioned them. One of the passengers, a well-dressed woman in her late 50s, reached for the call button. Grace, the younger flight attendant who had witnessed everything, appeared a moment later. The woman folded her arms. I want to file a formal complaint against the way that family was treated. Grace's eyes lit up with something close to relief. You're not the only one, she said quietly. The businessman across the aisle chimed in. Who do we need to talk to? Because what just happened wasn't right. Grace hesitated for a split second. Then, her gaze hardened with determination. I'll make sure your complaints are heard, she said, and I suggest you stay in your seats. Why? Another passenger asked. Grace's lips curved into a small smile. Because I think things are about to get very interesting. Back in the airline's corporate headquarters, inside a high-rise office in New York City, a boardroom full of senior executives sat in stunned silence as the CEO, Robert Langston, finished reading the emergency briefing. Langston rubbed his temples, his jaw tightening. This is a disaster, one of the board members muttered. Another executive nodded, tapping furiously on his laptop. Social media is already picking it up. There's footage being shared by passengers. Langston's eyes snapped up. Footage? The man nodded grimly. Yep, multiple angles. People are pissed. Langston turned to his PR director. What's our response plan? The woman exhaled. We need to get ahead of this before Carter makes a statement. Langston's expression darkened. Oh, he's going to make a statement. And if we don't fix this fast, it's going to cost us a hell of a lot more than an apology. He grabbed his phone and barked an order. Get me Rebecca Summers on the line. Now. Back on the plane. Rebecca's last stand. Rebecca had barely left the cockpit when her radio buzzed in her earpiece. It was corporate. She froze in the galley before pressing the button. This is Summers. The voice on the other end was ice cold. Miss Summers, you need to fix this immediately. Her breath caught in her throat. I was just following. No more excuses. The voice was cutting. Escort the Carters back to first class. And for God's sake, apologize. Rebecca's face burned with humiliation. But she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and made her way back to the main cabin. Each step feeling like a walk to the executioner's chair. She stopped in front of Michael Carter, who looked up at her with an expression of amused patience. Mr. Carter, she started, voice tight with forced politeness. There was an error in your seating assignment. We'd like to return you and your family to your original seats in first class. Silence hung in the air. Then, Vanessa arched an eyebrow. Oh, really? Just an error? Michael tilted his head slightly, letting the moment stretch. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. I apologize for the inconvenience. Michael smiled, not kindly, but knowingly. Then, he stood up, slowly adjusting his suit jacket, exuding the kind of confidence that made it clear he wasn't the one being embarrassed. Apology noted, he said, but not accepted. Rebecca's stomach dropped. Michael turned to Vanessa. Shall we? With that, the Carter family strode back toward first class, not as defeated passengers, but as the ones who had already won. And Rebecca? She was left standing in the aisle, cheeks burning, as whispers began again, but this time, they were about her. She had lost. First class, a new dynamic. As Michael Carter and his family returned to their first class seats, the entire atmosphere had shifted. Before, they were unwelcome intruders. Now, they were the center of attention, but in a way that made Rebecca squirm. Passengers who had ignored them before now smiled politely. Some even nodded in silent apology. Vanessa lifted Ethan onto his seat, buckled him in, and shot Michael a glance that said, "You better finish this." Michael just gave her a slight smirk. Oh, he would. Across the aisle, Rebecca stood frozen, her nails digging into her palms. Her mind raced through damage control scenarios. But it was too late. She had already lost. She could feel it in the way passengers whispered behind their hands. She could feel it in the tightness in her chest. The way her body knew, even before her mind fully accepted it. Her career was on life support. And the final blow was coming. The tipping point. Passengers turned against Rebecca. The first-class cabin erupted into conversation. Did you see how she treated them? Disgusting. And to think she thought she'd get away with it. Someone better record this for the news. One passenger, a well-dressed businessman in his 50s, stood up. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and spoke loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. Excuse me, but I'd like to know exactly why this man and his family were removed in the first place. Silence. Passengers turned to Rebecca, eyes sharp, expectant. She froze. I was following. A woman interrupted. Following what? Racist instincts? Gasps rippled through the cabin. Rebecca's face burned red. She stammered. Another man leaned back in his seat, shaking his head. Unbelievable. You treated a paying customer like a criminal. And now you can't even own up to it? Grace, the younger flight attendant who had seen everything unfold, stepped forward. Unlike Rebecca, she wasn't flustered. She wasn't panicking. She was angry. And she wasn't afraid to show it. I'd like to apologize, Grace said, addressing the Carters directly. This was wrong. It never should have happened. Rebecca whipped around. Grace held up a hand. No, I'm done covering for you. A murmur of approval ran through the cabin. Rebecca felt the walls closing in. And then, the corporate firestorm begins. In New York City, inside the airline's executive boardroom, CEO Robert Langston slammed his hands on the table. The screen in front of him played live footage from the flight, recorded by passengers and now going viral online. #boycott, airline name, was trending. News anchors were already dissecting the controversy. Michael Carter's name was on every headline. Langston's phone buzzed relentlessly. A PR executive ran into the room. Breathless. "Sir," she gasped. "It's worse than we thought. A major news outlet just published an exposé on racial discrimination within our airline." Langston's blood ran cold. This wasn't just one mistake anymore. This was a ticking time bomb. And it was about to explode. "Get me the Carters on the phone," he snapped. "Now." The call that ended it all. Back on the flight, Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced down, recognized the number. A slow smile spread across his face. He answered casually. "Robert, I was wondering when I'd hear from you." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She could hear the CEO's frantic voice through the speaker. "Michael, please, let's talk. Let's fix this before it gets any worse." Michael leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "I'm listening." Rebecca squeezed her hands together so tightly they ached. She wanted to scream. This was her fate being decided. Right in front of her, while she stood there. Powerless. Langston's voice was tense. "The airline takes full responsibility. We want to issue a formal public apology, for me personally. We'll also launch an internal investigation, review policies, and offer full compensation." Michael glanced at Vanessa. She gave him a look that said, "Make them pay." He smiled slightly. "Not enough." Langston exhaled sharply. "What else do you want?" Michael's voice dropped to a chilling calm. "Rebecca Summers. Fired. Publicly." Rebecca's legs buckled. Langston hesitated. "Michael, we can't just." Michael cut him off. "Then I'll be speaking to every major news outlet by morning. And I'll make sure my lawyers are ready." Silence. Then, Langston sighed. Defeated. "Consider it done." Michael smiled. "Good choice." He ended the call. Rebecca stumbled back, hitting the galley wall. Grace watched her with zero sympathy. Passengers clapped in quiet satisfaction. Vanessa kissed Michael's cheek. "You are so damn hot when you destroy people." Ethan, oblivious to the chaos, sipped his juice box. And just like that, Rebecca Summers was no longer employed. The walk of shame. Rebecca Summers had never felt this kind of humiliation before. Her hands trembled as she stumbled toward the galley. Her mind spinning. Passengers in first class watched her like she was a villain in a movie. Some had their phones out, recording her downfall in real time. Grace, the younger flight attendant who had called her out, gave her a look that said, "I warned you." Then, just when Rebecca thought it couldn't get any worse, the plane's intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. As we prepare for landing, we'd like to remind all passengers to remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop." Then, after a slight pause, "And to our first-class passengers, we apologize for the unfortunate incident that occurred earlier. Rest assured, appropriate action has already been taken." The words were polite, but everyone knew what it meant. Rebecca closed her eyes. She had officially been thrown under the bus. Corporate war erupts. Back at the airline's corporate headquarters, CEO Robert Langston was furious. He had just gotten off the phone with the board of directors, who were now demanding a formal review of the airline's handling of discrimination complaints. "We're hemorrhaging money," an executive snapped, throwing a report onto the table. "Our stock took a hit this morning. We need to control the narrative." Langston's jaw tightened. "This is on you, Robert," a board member said coldly. "You let this escalate." Langston's anger boiled over. "I let this escalate? Do you have any idea who Carter is? The man could buy this entire company if he wanted to. You should be grateful he only demanded an apology." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Then, one of them, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, spoke. "He didn't demand just an apology," she said. Langston froze. "What?" The woman slid a document across the table. Langston scanned the first few lines, and his blood ran cold. It was an official shareholder motion, filed by Michael Carter, effective immediately. He was petitioning to replace Langston as CEO. Landing. The storm isn't over yet. As the plane touched down, Rebecca's heart pounded. The moment the wheels hit the runway, she reached for her phone with shaking hands, desperate to check if there was a way to fix this. But the moment she turned it on, she realized the world had already made up its mind. Her notifications were flooded. Rebecca Summers trending #1. News articles calling her the face of airline discrimination. Thousands of people calling for a boycott of the airline. A petition demanding she never work in customer service again. Her breath hitched. She had lost everything. Then came the final blow. An email from our subject. Notice of termination. She couldn't breathe. Her career, her reputation, gone. Just like that. Michael's final move. Inside the airport's VIP lounge, Michael Carter leaned back in his chair, sipping an espresso. His phone buzzed. It was his legal team. Michael, the lead attorney said, "It's done. Langston's position is officially being challenged. If the board sides with you, he's out." Michael smirked. Good. Vanessa sat across from him, watching him carefully. You think they'll vote him out? Michael exhaled slowly. If they're smart, they will. Then, his phone buzzed again. An unknown number. He answered. Carter. A nervous voice came through the line. Mr. Carter, it's Rebecca Summers. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Michael's expression remained unreadable. Rebecca took a shaky breath. I know you have no reason to listen to me. But I wanted to apologize. Truly. Silence. Then, Michael's voice was calm, but firm. You didn't see me, Rebecca. That's the problem. She swallowed hard. I know, she whispered, and I lost everything because of it. Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. No, you lost everything because you refused to change, until it was too late. Rebecca went silent. Michael let the silence stretch. Then, finally, he said, I hope you learn from this. And with that, he hung up. Rebecca stared at her screen. Defeated. She had thought that losing her job was the worst part. But the truth? The worst part was realizing she had done this to herself. Rebecca's last hope, a desperate attempt to fight back. Rebecca Summers sat in a dimly lit hotel room, staring at her laptop screen, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. Her entire life had unraveled in less than 24 hours. The termination email, the flood of hate messages on social media, the news outlets ripping her apart, labeling her the symbol of discrimination in customer service. But the worst part? She couldn't find a single lawyer willing to take her case. No one wanted to represent the woman who got fired for discrimination on a viral flight. But then, her phone buzzed. A private message. It was from a man named Victor Harrington, a high-profile corporate crisis manager known for protecting controversial public figures. Rebecca's hands shook as she read the message. Rebecca, I can help you rebuild your career. But first, we need to fight back. Call me. Her heart raced. This wasn't over yet. Michael's unexpected challenge, the CEO strikes back. Meanwhile, inside a private executive meeting room in Manhattan, CEO Robert Langston paced furiously. His phone pressed to his ear. What do you mean the board is considering Carter's proposal? He snapped. His lawyer's voice was tight with hesitation. Michael Carter has enough shareholder support to force a vote on your removal. Sir, if you don't act fast, he'll have your job within a week. Langston's jaw clenched. Michael Carter had already destroyed his airline's reputation. Now, he was coming for his job. The CEO slammed his hand on the desk. No, I'm not going down that easily. His mind raced. If he wanted to survive this, he needed leverage, and he knew exactly where to find it. Rebecca and Langston, the unlikely alliance. The next day, Rebecca Summers arrived at a private law firm in New York City. She expected a meeting with Victor Harrington, but when she stepped inside, her stomach dropped. Sitting at the head of the conference table was Robert Langston. She froze. What is this? Langston smirked. An opportunity. Rebecca's pulse pounded. Langston leaned forward, his eyes sharp. You want your career back. I want my airline back. We have a common enemy, Michael Carter. Rebecca's mouth went dry. She had never imagined working with the same man who had just fired her. But Langston's next words made her blood turn cold. I have something that could turn this entire situation against Carter. Rebecca's heart pounded. Go on, she whispered. Langston slid a sealed envelope across the table. Rebecca picked it up with shaky hands and opened it. Inside were documents, photos, and confidential records, all about Michael Carter. Her eyes widened. If this gets out, Langston said smoothly, he won't just lose his fight against me. He'll lose everything. Rebecca exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the papers. She had a choice. She could disappear into infamy. Or she could fight back, even if it meant destroying Michael Carter. Her hands shook as she whispered the question. What do you want me to do? Langston smiled. Follow my lead. Michael's growing problems, a dangerous smear campaign. By the next morning, Michael woke up to dozens of missed calls. Something was wrong. Vanessa sat at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone. Her face turned pale. "Oh my God," she muttered. Michael grabbed his own phone, and his stomach dropped. The headlines were brutal. Loudspeaker breaking news. Is Michael Carter really who he says he is? Airline investor caught in a scandal. Loudspeaker former flight attendant speaks out. "I was just doing my job." Loudspeaker exclusive leaks reveal Carter's hidden business dealings. Did he manipulate his power? Michael's blood boiled. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had set him up. And then, his phone rang. A familiar voice came through. "Michael," said a grim voice on the other end. "It's Rebecca Summers. We need to talk." Michael's jaw tightened. She was the last person he wanted to hear from. But something in her tone made him pause. He exhaled slowly. "I'm listening." Rebecca hesitated. "I made a mistake. And now, I think they're using me to destroy you." Michael's mind sharpened. "They?" A deep breath. "Langston." Michael's fist clenched. Now, it was war. Rebecca's confession, a betrayal unfolds. Michael Carter stood near the window of his luxury penthouse, staring at the Manhattan skyline. His phone was still pressed to his ear. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice calm but lethal. "Langston fed you false information to use against me?" On the other end, Rebecca's voice was shaky. "Yes, he told me if I helped him, he'd get my job back and clear my name," she admitted. Michael exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. "And you believed him?" Rebecca swallowed hard. I wasn't thinking. I was desperate." Vanessa, sitting on the couch across the room, folded her arms. "That's not desperation," she said coolly. "That's greed." Rebecca flinched at the truth of it. Michael pinched the bridge of his nose. "All right, what exactly did he give you?" There was a pause before Rebecca said, "Confidential records, mostly fabricated. He wants the board to believe you used insider information to manipulate airline shares. He also leaked fake witness statements, claiming you've bullied executives into making company decisions." Michael smirked. "That's cute. Too bad none of it is true." Rebecca hesitated. "I think he's planning something bigger. He wants you gone, Michael. Completely." Michael rolled his shoulders. A slow, confident movement. "Let him try." The counterattack, a masterstroke of strategy. Langston sat in his corner office, watching the news unfold on a giant TV screen. His smear campaign was working. Headlines were everywhere. Loudspeaker, Michael Carter's dirty secrets, the fall of a corporate giant? Loudspeaker, is the airline's biggest investor a fraud? Langston smiled. By the time Michael could fight back, the damage would be done. Just then, his assistant rushed in, her face pale. "Sir, you need to see this." She handed him a tablet. Langston's eyes narrowed as he read the breaking news update. Loudspeaker, leaked recordings expose CEO Robert Langston, secret deals and corporate corruption. Loudspeaker, inside source. Langston orchestrated false smear campaign against Carter. Langston's stomach dropped. "What the hell is this?" he barked. His assistant's hands shook. "Sir, Michael Carter just released proof that you fabricated evidence against him." Langston's blood ran cold. The TV screen flickered, showing a press conference. Standing before reporters, Michael Carter adjusted his tie and smiled effortlessly. "I'd like to thank the media for their concern about my business dealings," he said smoothly. "But it turns out, the real corruption isn't on my side." The cameras zoomed in as he held up a flash drive. This contains recordings and emails proving that CEO Robert Langston launched a false smear campaign against me to cover up his own shady deals. Langston's vision blurred. "No, no, no, no," Michael continued, his voice casual but deadly. "I have emails from his private server, witness testimonies, and transaction records showing that Langston funneled company funds into shell corporations." Gasps echoed through the press room. Michael turned to the camera, eyes sharp. "To my fellow shareholders, this is the man running your airline. I trust you'll make the right decision." Langston's fall, the end of the line. Inside a private boardroom, Langston faced the worst moment of his career. Every board member sat across from him, their expressions ice cold. "Robert," one of them said, barely containing his disgust, "we cannot ignore this." Langston tried to speak. The chairman slammed a folder down. Save it. Your resignation is already prepared. Langston's chest tightened. You can't do this. The chairman cut him off. If you don't sign, we'll fire you. Either way, you're done. Langston's hands shook as he grabbed the pen. With trembling fingers, he signed his name. And just like that, Robert Langston was no longer CEO. Rebecca's final reckoning. Meanwhile, Rebecca sat in her apartment, watching the news unfold. Her phone buzzed with a single email from the airline's HR department. Outgoing mail subject. Notice of permanent blacklisting. Her throat closed. The message was brief. Due to the severity of your actions and the public nature of this incident, you are permanently banned from working for any airline or affiliated business in our network. This decision is final. Rebecca's heart pounded. She had thought losing her job was bad. But this? She was done. No airline, no career, no future. Her phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floor. She had gambled and lost everything. The aftermath, a legacy restored. A week later, Michael Carter sat in his executive office, staring out at the city skyline. Vanessa walked in, holding a letter from the airline's board. They voted unanimously, she said, grinning. Michael took the letter and read the first line. Page facing up, Dear Mr. Carter, we are pleased to formally offer you the position of chairman of the board of directors. Michael's smile was slow and satisfied. He had gone from targeted victim to the most powerful man in the airline. Vanessa kissed his cheek. So, was it worth it? Michael exhaled. Every damn second. He leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the polished wood desk. Rebecca was gone. Langston was ruined. And now? Michael Carter owned the skies. Game over. Fire final thoughts. Langston is publicly exposed and forced to resign. Rebecca is permanently blacklisted from the airline industry. Michael wins the ultimate revenge, becoming chairman of the board. The final line cements his power, proving he wasn't just fighting for respect, he was fighting for legacy. Final question for readers. Right finger, what would you have done in Michael's position? Would you have fought back, or walked away? Lessons from Michael Carter's story, applying it to real life. The story of Michael Carter isn't just about revenge or corporate power. It's a reflection of real-world issues that many people face every day. Discrimination, abuse of authority, and the fight for justice. Key takeaways for real life. Know your worth, and stand up for it. Michael never lashed out emotionally. He stayed calm, collected, and strategic. In real life, when faced with unfair treatment, don't react with anger, respond with intelligence. Gather facts, use resources, and let your actions speak louder than words. Power should be used to uplift, not oppress. Langston and Rebecca abused their power and paid the price. True leaders don't use authority to tear people down, they use it to create fairness and opportunity. Integrity always wins in the end. Lies, deceit, and manipulation might work temporarily, but truth always catches up. Whether in business, friendships, or life, choosing integrity will always put you on the right side of history. Reputation is everything. In today's world, your reputation follows you everywhere, especially with social media. Treat people with respect, regardless of status, because one mistake can cost you everything. Final thought. At some point, we will all face a moment of injustice. The real question is, will you handle it with wisdom and strategy, or let it defeat you? Rocket.